Have you ever noticed that every time you start to feel genuinely happy, something inside you pulls you back? Nothing bad is happening. Your life isn't falling apart. You're not in crisis. And yet, instead of relief, a strange discomfort appears. Almost like you've crossed a line you weren't supposed to cross. You might not call it guilt at first. It feels subtler than that. Heavier. Like you've left something behind. You start to wonder who you're becoming. Whether you're allowed to feel this good. Whether someone, somewhere, is being abandoned because you are okay. And suddenly, happiness doesn't feel free. It feels disloyal. This isn't the kind of guilt that comes from doing something wrong. It comes from doing something different. Different from what you were used to. Different from the emotional world you came from. Different from the version of yourself that once belonged somewhere else. For some people, happiness isn't just personal. It feels relational. As if feeling better means separating from a shared emotional history. You're no longer carrying the same weight. You're no longer standing in the same place. And that movement feels dangerous. Because belonging once depended on staying close, not physically, but emotionally. Staying close to the struggle, to the pain, to the unspoken rules of who you were allowed to be. So when you start to feel lighter, something inside you resists. Not because you don't want happiness, but because happiness threatens connection. You may have learned, without ever being told, that love meant staying aligned with the emotional tone of your environment. If others suffered, you stayed serious. If others struggled, you stayed grounded in struggle. If life was heavy, you didn't rise above it. Not out of obligation, out of loyalty. So now, when joy appears, it feels like stepping out of formation. Like moving ahead while others remain behind. And that creates an internal conflict. One part of you wants to move forward. Another part fears that movement means separation. So happiness feels like betrayal. Not of people, but of bonds. Invisible bonds that once kept you safe. This is why happiness can feel lonely. Not because you are alone, but because you are no longer sharing the same emotional ground. You may even notice that, when things start going well, your mind brings up memories. Old struggles. Past versions of yourself. People who didn't make it this far. As if to remind you where you came from. As if to pull you back. Because if you move too far ahead, who are you without them? And who are you to them? This kind of guilt doesn't shout. It whispers. It says, don't forget where you came from. Don't change too much. Don't outgrow what once held you. So you soften your happiness. You minimize it. You keep it quiet. You don't fully inhabit it. Because fully inhabiting it would mean accepting distance. And distance feels like loss. For some people, this guilt is tied to family. If your family lived with limitation, hardship, or emotional restraint, happiness can feel like a rupture. You're not just doing better. You're doing differently. And difference can feel like rejection. For others, it's tied to identity. If your sense of self was built around endurance, strength, or survival, happiness feels like stepping out of character. Who are you without the weight? Without the seriousness? Without the role of the one who carries things? Happiness doesn't just bring pleasure. It brings uncertainty. And uncertainty threatens belonging. So instead of fully allowing happiness, you hesitate. You wait for it to pass. You prepare for consequences. You keep one foot anchored in the past. Because moving fully into joy feels like leaving something, or someone, behind. And that feels wrong. This is why happiness can feel undeserved. Not because you didn't work hard enough, but because working hard together once meant staying together. And now, ease feels like separation. This isn't selfishness. It's attachment. Attachment to a shared emotional reality that once defined safety. Your system learned that staying aligned mattered more than standing out. So happiness triggers alarm. Not because joy is dangerous, but because difference is. Difference changes the relationship. Difference creates distance. And distance once meant loss. So your body responds with guilt. Not to punish you, but to pull you back into alignment. Back into familiarity. Back into connection as you once knew it. This is why happiness can feel like a betrayal even when no one is accusing you. The accusation comes from inside, from an old rule that says, if you feel better, you leave something behind. But what if that rule no longer applies? What if happiness doesn't mean abandoning your past, but honoring it by no longer repeating it? What if moving forward isn't betrayal, but transformation? These are questions your system hasn't learned to answer yet. So it reacts with guilt instead. Not because you're wrong, but because you're changing. And change always tests loyalty. To understand why happiness can feel like betrayal, you have to look at how belonging was learned, not how morality was taught. This guilt does not come from rules. It comes from relationships. Long before you had words for loyalty or independence, your nervous system learned something quietly. Staying emotionally aligned kept you connected. Belonging wasn't just about being loved. It was about staying in sync. If the emotional atmosphere around you was heavy, you learned to be serious. If the people you depended on were struggling, you learned not to rise too far above that struggle. Not because anyone told you to, but because connection depended on it. Your system learned that emotional closeness required emotional sameness, and sameness meant safety. This is how loyalty begins to take shape, not as a conscious value, but as an emotional reflex. You learned that to belong, you had to share the emotional weight of the group. If others were overwhelmed, you didn't allow yourself to relax. If others were hurting, you didn't allow yourself to feel light. If others were stuck, you didn't move too far ahead. Moving ahead created distance, and distance felt dangerous. So your system learned to regulate happiness, not because happiness was bad, but because happiness disrupted alignment. This learning often happens in subtle ways. No one says, "Don't be happy," but the atmosphere teaches you what is allowed. You notice that joy feels awkward in certain rooms. That excitement is met with silence. That relief makes others uncomfortable. So you adapt. You soften your reactions. You downplay good news. You learn to read the room before you allow yourself to feel anything fully. Over time, this becomes automatic. Your nervous system starts to associate happiness with risk, not physical risk, but relational risk. The risk of standing apart. The risk of being seen as different. The risk of no longer being needed in the same way. Because for many people, being needed was the glue that held belonging together. If your role in a system was to support, stabilize, or carry emotional weight, your value came from staying close to difficulty. Happiness threatened that role. If you felt okay, who would you be? If you weren't struggling, how would you stay connected? So guilt emerged as a regulating force. It didn't accuse you of wrongdoing. It warned you of separation. It told you, "Careful, you're drifting." This is why this guilt feels relational rather than personal. It doesn't say, "You're bad." It says, "You're leaving." Leaving the emotional position that once kept you safe. This is also why happiness can trigger memories. When you feel lighter, your mind pulls you back to earlier chapters. Moments of shared struggle. People who lived with limitation. Versions of yourself that survived under pressure. These memories don't appear randomly. They serve a function. They remind you of the emotional contract you once lived by. An unspoken agreement that said, "We carry this together." So when you stop carrying it, even internally, guilt appears. Not because you are disloyal, but because your system fears disconnection. This dynamic is especially strong in families, where emotional survival depended on mutual endurance. In those systems, closeness wasn't built on comfort. It was built on shared burden. Everyone stayed afloat by staying serious, by staying alert, by staying emotionally engaged with what was difficult. Happiness, in those environments, felt foreign. It disrupted the rhythm. So when you experience happiness later in life, your system doesn't recognize it as neutral. It recognizes it as a deviation. And deviation threatens belonging. This is where guilt becomes automatic. It steps in to restore alignment. It encourages you to minimize joy, to soften relief, to stay emotionally available to the past. Because emotional availability once meant safety. Another layer of this guilt comes from identity. If your sense of self formed around resilience, strength, or endurance, happiness feels destabilizing. It asks you to become someone you haven't rehearsed being. Someone lighter. Someone less serious. Someone not defined by survival. That shift can feel like betrayal of the self you once needed to be. So guilt appears to protect continuity. It says, "Don't change too much." Because change threatens coherence. This is why happiness can feel wrong even when it is earned. Because earning was never the issue. Belonging was. Your system learned that staying emotionally aligned mattered more than feeling good. So happiness feels like stepping outside the circle. And circles once meant protection. This guilt is also reinforced by repetition. Each time you softened your joy to maintain harmony, the pattern strengthened. Each time you stayed serious to avoid discomfort, the system learned, this keeps us connected. Over time, guilt became the signal that keeps you in place. It doesn't punish happiness. It regulates it. Keeps joy from creating distance. This is why logic doesn't dissolve this guilt. You can tell yourself that happiness doesn't hurt anyone. But your nervous system responds to learned patterns, not explanations. It remembers that alignment once mattered. And happiness disrupts alignment. So guilt steps in. Not as an enemy, but as a protector of belonging. The problem is that the belonging it protects is no longer accurate. It is based on an emotional reality that has changed. You are no longer dependent on staying small to remain connected. But your system hasn't updated that rule yet. So it reacts as if the old conditions still apply. This is why happiness can feel unsafe even when nothing bad happens. Because your system is responding to a relational memory. A memory that says, if you move too far ahead, you lose something. But this memory is incomplete. It remembers the cost of separation, but not the possibility of connection without sameness. It remembers survival, but not expansion. Understanding where this guilt comes from doesn't remove it instantly, but it changes your relationship to it. Because you stop seeing guilt as truth. You start seeing it as history, a history that once kept you connected, but no longer needs to dictate who you become. Once happiness becomes associated with separation, guilt doesn't stay abstract. It shows up in very practical, everyday ways. Not as a dramatic thought, but as a quiet adjustment you make without noticing. You might see it first in how you handle good news. When something positive happens, you hesitate before sharing it. You soften the tone. You add disclaimers. You say things like, "It's nothing big. I don't want to make a big deal out of it. I know others have it worse." This isn't humility. It's containment. You're managing the emotional distance your happiness might create. Because if joy sets you apart, guilt pulls you back in. Another place this guilt appears is in how long you allow yourself to enjoy something. The moment happiness arrives, a clock starts ticking. You feel it internally. Don't get used to this. This won't last. Stay grounded. So instead of staying present, you prepare for reversal. You scan for what could go wrong. You anticipate the drop. This doesn't come from pessimism. It comes from loyalty. A loyalty to an emotional world, where staying aligned mattered more than staying joyful. You may also notice this guilt in relationships that improve. When a relationship becomes easier, more stable, more supportive, you feel a strange discomfort. Not because something is missing, but because something familiar is gone. You're no longer bonded through struggle, and that absence can feel like loss. You might compensate by reintroducing seriousness. You overthink conversations. You revisit old problems. You look for something to fix. Because ease feels like distance, and distance feels disloyal. This guilt also shapes how you relate to people who are still struggling. When someone close to you is unhappy, your happiness feels inappropriate. You lower your tone. You shrink your joy. You make yourself emotionally available in a way that costs you. Not because they ask, but because staying light feels like abandonment. So you carry emotional weight that isn't yours. You stay with them by staying heavy, and guilt makes that feel like care. But over time, this pattern becomes exhausting, because you're not just empathizing. You're restricting your own life to maintain emotional alignment. This is also how guilt influences your choices. When given options, you often choose what keeps you closer to your past rather than what moves you forward. You hesitate to accept opportunities that would change your position. You delay growth. You second-guess progress. Not because you don't want more, but because more creates distance. Distance from who you were. Distance from who others expect you to be. So guilt intervenes. It frames growth as selfishness, change as abandonment, joy as betrayal. This is especially strong when your happiness contrasts with someone else's pain. You might feel like your improvement highlights their suffering. And instead of holding both realities at once, guilt tells you to choose. To stay emotionally close by staying emotionally similar. So you dim yourself. You also see this guilt in how you relate to your own past. When life improves, you feel pulled back toward earlier versions of yourself. You revisit old struggles. You romanticize survival. You stay emotionally loyal to pain that is no longer present. Because that pain once defined belonging, and leaving it behind feels like denying its importance. So guilt preserves it. This is why happiness can feel shallow at first. Not because it is shallow, but because depth was once measured by endurance. And endurance required suffering. This guilt also shows up as discomfort with ease. When things work without effort, you question them. You distrust simplicity. You look for hidden costs. Because what came easily doesn't feel earned. But earned here doesn't mean deserved. It means shared. You learn to earn belonging by staying close to difficulty. So when happiness arrives without a shared struggle, guilt appears. It tells you something is missing. This pattern also affects how you experience identity. If your sense of self was shaped by being the one who survives, who holds things together, who stays strong, happiness can feel like a rusher. Who are you without the weight? Who are you if life is no longer a test? Guilt protects that old identity. It says, don't become unrecognizable. So you keep aspects of struggle alive. You stay serious when you could soften. You stay tense when you could relax. You stay emotionally invested in what's heavy. Because lightness feels unfamiliar. And unfamiliar feels risky. This guilt can even show up as self-sabotage. Not dramatic sabotage. Subtle choices. You delay joy. You complicate what's simple. You add pressure where none is required. Because guilt needs something to regulate. It needs friction. Without friction, it loses its role. So it creates reasons for you to feel undeserving. This is also why compliments can feel uncomfortable. When someone acknowledges your growth, your success, your happiness, guilt responds. You deflect. You minimize. You redirect attention. Because being seen in your happiness makes the separation visible. And visibility intensifies guilt. So you hide. This guilt doesn't only restrict joy. It restricts presence. You are rarely fully where you are. Part of you stays emotionally anchored to where you came from. And that split creates fatigue. You're carrying two realities at once. The present, which is lighter, and the past, which taught you that lightness creates distance. So guilt becomes the bridge between them. Keeps you from fully crossing into your current life. This is why happiness can feel incomplete. Not because something is wrong, but because you haven't allowed yourself to arrive. Arrival would mean accepting separation. And separation still feels like betrayal. But here is the important distinction. You are not betraying people by changing. You are betraying a pattern. A pattern that once required emotional sameness to maintain connection. And that pattern does not define love. It defines survival. Seeing how this guilt operates in daily life is not about judging yourself. It's about recognizing the cost. Because loyalty to pain eventually becomes disloyalty to yourself. And the longer guilt controls how close you allow yourself to get to joy, the more distant life feels, even when it improves. Understanding this pattern is the first moment where choice becomes possible. Not the choice to abandon your past, but the choice to stop letting it dictate your future. To loosen the hold this guilt has on you, one thing matters more than anything else. You must clearly understand what this guilt is not. Because this kind of guilt survives by borrowing meanings that do not belong to it. It pretends to be morality. It pretends to be care. It pretends to be loyalty. But it is none of those things. This guilt is not a sign that you are selfish. Selfishness is indifference. What you feel is concern taken too far. If you were selfish, you would not question your happiness. You would not worry about how it affects others. You would not feel this internal conflict at all. This guilt exists precisely because you care. It is not proof of moral failure. It is proof of emotional attachment. This guilt is not a warning about danger. True warnings feel grounded. They come with clarity. They point to something specific. This guilt feels vague, diffuse, unsettling without explanation. If you cannot name what you are doing wrong, it is not a warning. It is a reflex. Your body reacting to difference, not threat. This guilt is not intuition. Intuition brings direction. It guides you toward something. This guilt pulls you backward. It does not help you decide. It freezes you between who you were and who you are becoming. If a feeling makes you smaller instead of clearer, it is not intuition. This guilt is not humility. Humility allows you to receive without collapsing or inflating. This guilt rejects receiving altogether. Tells you that joy must be reduced, hidden, softened. That is not humility. That is fear of standing apart. This guilt is not respect for others' pain. Respect allows multiple truths to exist at the same time. This guilt demands emotional sameness. It says, if someone else is hurting, you must hurt too. That is not respect. That is emotional fusion. And fusion is not connection, it is fear of separation. This guilt is not love. Love does not require self-erasure. If your happiness feels like betrayal, it is not because love demands sacrifice. It is because your system learned that connection required sameness. Love can tolerate difference. Survival cannot. This guilt is not loyalty. True loyalty is chosen. This guilt is automatic. It activates even when no one is asking anything of you. If a feeling binds you without your consent, it is not loyalty. It is conditioning. This guilt is not responsibility. Responsibility responds to reality. This guilt ignores reality. It persists even when no harm is being done. If you feel responsible for managing others' emotions at the cost of your own life, guilt has replaced responsibility. This guilt is not gratitude. Gratitude expands your capacity to hold joy. This guilt shrinks it. If a feeling prevents you from enjoying what you have, it is not gratitude. It is self-censorship. This guilt is not maturity. Maturity allows complexity. It allows joy and pain to coexist without canceling each other. This guilt demands simplicity. It says, choose one, stay aligned, don't complicate. But life is complicated. And maturity does not require emotional conformity. This guilt is not protection anymore. It may have protected you once. It may have kept you connected when separation meant danger. But protection that does not update becomes limitation. If a response continues long after the original conditions have changed, it is no longer serving you. It is preserving the past. This guilt is not your identity. It feels personal because it is familiar. But familiarity is not selfhood. If guilt disappears in moments of deep safety, then guilt was never who you are. It was what you learned. This guilt is not truth. It feels convincing because it carries emotional weight. But emotional weight is not evidence. Your body is remembering a rule that no longer applies. A rule that said, do not move ahead alone. But you're not alone anymore. And even if you were, growth is not abandonment. This guilt is not asking you to go back. It is asking you to stop. To pause mid-transition, to remain suspended between versions of yourself. But life does not happen in suspension. It happens in movement. This guilt is not asking you to betray others. It is asking you to remain recognizable. But being recognizable is not the same as being connected. Connection can survive change. Control cannot. This guilt is not a command. It feels like one because you have obeyed it for so long. But it is a signal that something old is being activated. And signals can be acknowledged without being followed. You can notice guilt without letting it decide. You can feel it without treating it as truth. This guilt is not permanent. It feels persistent because it has not been questioned. Patterns weaken when they lose meaning. And guilt loses meaning when it is no longer mistaken for virtue. Seeing what this guilt is not removes its moral authority. It no longer tells you who you should be. It simply reveals where you learn to stay. And once guilt no longer defines goodness, something shifts. Joy becomes less threatening. Difference becomes less dangerous. Growth becomes less lonely. You do not have to reject your past to move forward. You do not have to abandon anyone to become happier. And you do not have to suffer to belong. This guilt may still appear, but it no longer gets to decide who you become. If happiness has been feeling heavy instead of light, it's not because something is wrong with you. It's because happiness is asking you to stand somewhere new. And new places always feel unstable at first. When guilt appears as you start to feel better, it can feel like a warning. Like a voice saying, "Careful, you're going too far." But what that voice is really reacting to is distance. Not distance from people, but distance from a version of yourself that once needed to stay close to pain in order to belong. For a long time, staying emotionally aligned kept you safe. It kept relationships intact. It kept you recognizable. So when happiness arrives, your system doesn't celebrate. It hesitates. Because happiness changes your position. It shifts how you relate to your past. It shifts how you relate to others. It shifts how you relate to yourself. And any shift brings uncertainty. So guilt steps in, not to punish you, but to slow you down. To keep you from moving too quickly into a life that feels unfamiliar. Understanding this changes the question. Instead of asking, "Why do I feel guilty for being happy?" you begin to ask, "What part of me feels left behind when I move forward?" Because guilt often protects what once mattered. It protects old bonds, old identities, old ways of staying connected. But protection is not always guidance. Sometimes it's simply habit. Learning to let happiness exist without betrayal does not mean cutting ties with your past. It means allowing connection to evolve. You can honor where you came from without staying there. You can remember who you were without continuing to live as them. Growth does not erase loyalty. It transforms it. Real loyalty is not about staying the same. It's about staying honest. And honesty sometimes requires you to admit that you no longer need to suffer to belong. At first, happiness may feel incomplete. You may feel like you're standing on unstable ground. Not fully relaxed. Not fully convinced. That doesn't mean happiness is fragile. It means your system is still learning how to stand somewhere new. You don't need to force yourself to feel grateful. You don't need to justify your joy. You don't need to prove that you deserve it. You only need to let it exist, quietly, without apology. Guilt may still appear. That doesn't mean you're going backward. It means your system is noticing the change. When guilt shows up, you don't need to argue with it. You don't need to obey it either. You can simply notice it and ask, "What is this asking me to stay loyal to?" Often, the answer is not a person. It's a role. The role of the one who carries. The one who endures. The one who stays serious. That role once mattered. Kept you connected. but you are allowed to outgrow roles that no longer fit. Belonging does not have to be earned through suffering. Connection does not require emotional sameness. And happiness does not require betrayal. What feels like betrayal is often just separation from an old pattern. A pattern that once kept you safe, but no longer needs to define you. You are not abandoning your past by becoming happier. You are completing it. You are allowing the survival chapter to end so something else can begin. And endings can feel disloyal before they feel freeing. So if happiness feels strange right now, let it be strange. Strangeness is not danger. It is adjustment. You don't have to rush into joy. You don't have to announce it. You don't have to make it permanent. You only have to stop punishing yourself for touching it. Over time, happiness will stop feeling like a separation. It will start feeling like a continuation, not of pain, but of growth. And one day, without realizing when it happened, you will notice something subtle. You are no longer scanning for who you might be leaving behind. You are simply present where you are. And happiness no longer feels like betrayal. It feels like permission.